Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to SimCorp Agile MeetUp. Today I have the pleasure of presenting you Maria Ebro, who will talk about changing your company culture through agile ways of working. Maria is currently a management consultant with the Implement Consulting Group, and she has experience in driving large-scale transformation and change management initiatives, most recently from the financial industry. Maria has a degree in psychology and philosophy, and she is interested in the behavioral change. So Maria has prepared a very exciting session for you today. And as you can see, she's attending from a special environment to give us a great participant experience. So all you need to do is turn on your camera if you can. And thanks to all of you for that. Use the chat box and other channels actively, and then relax and enjoy. Stage is yours, Maria.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for having me and letting me present about this sort of passion topic of mine. I'm really looking forward to that. Before I get started, I would like a bit of interaction with all of you. So if I can ask you to log on to slido.com and use the participant code I just posted in the chat, I would like to just get us started so that I also know where are all of you on your journey so that I can better sort of tailor whatever I talk about here to hit you in the right way. We can also at the end, you can also post questions in there, and at the end, we can go through some of them as well. But let's start up in there. If you go in there, you use the participant code, and then I'm gonna ask a few questions, and I ask you to vote on your answer just to get us started a little bit here. So first of all, how far are you on your agile transformation? Are you just getting started? Have you been at it for a little while? Have you been working on it for a long time, or like forever, 5+ years, or what? Okay. See people putting in the answers. I'm also sharing the screen in the Teams where you can see the answers if you're interested to see what others have replied. I can see that half of you is just getting started on the journey. Then we have about a fourth or a third who is 5+ years, some very experienced people, and then a few in the middle. So that's perfect for me to know. Now for the next one, I also want to ask specifically how familiar you are with the Scrum ceremonies and artifacts, because those are some of the things I will be talking a little bit about. So I'm just gonna turn that on and see how familiar are you with the Scrum ceremonies and artifacts. Not at all, fairly familiar, I know them all theoretically, or I have worked with it for a while. Okay, so even though a lot of you are just getting started on the sort of big agile transformation, a lot of you seem to be quite familiar with the Scrum ceremonies. For the 10% who is not at all familiar with it, I hope you can still follow some of the points I'm making, even though I'm not gonna explain all the ceremonies here, but hopefully it will be explanatory in itself. And then final question before I jump into a more presentation mode is, how experienced are you within psychology and behavioral science? Is it I know close to nothing? Is it I have some knowledge? Or is it I know all about, you know, Shine, Kahneman, Prehn, Luhmann, all the theorists within this topic? Okay, cool. So we have a good half that has some knowledge, someone who knows close to nothing, and then no one who knows all of these theories, but that's a good thing, because then I can tailor that. I explain a little bit about each of them when I bring them on board for you today. So I'm just gonna hit some screen changes here so that I share in the right way. 1 second. There we go. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
And it's a big full screen PowerPoint, correct?
It is correct.
Perfect. Then I will also just like to be able to see you guys. So just a second. And now I can see you as well. So the final thing, Slido we've already been on. The final thing I would like you guys to do is in Teams, there's a function called raise your hand. It's a little face with a hand on it, or just a hand, depending on which version of Teams you have. If you guys in your company strategy have been working with some of these terms: transparency, trust, empowerment, trying to be more efficient, and create more collaboration. If those have been focus areas in your company strategy or values over the past decade, please raise your hand in Teams. Cool, I see the hands going up. Perfect. Thank you. You can bring them down again. And then if you have questions, you're free to raise them again if you would like to. Okay. So working with these kind of terms, you most likely, or at least I've seen a bunch of times, that it's been written in the strategies, it's been the values of the company, it's been in articles and headlines, it's even been part of leadership sessions or workshops, all to have no real change or very little change happening at the floor of the organization, with people actually changing their behaviors or breaking down silos or whatever it may be you had in the strategy. So my point today is that we need to work more with the psychological part of people's brains and minds to do this change management, and that Agile can actually be quite a good lever for doing so. So I'm going to present some of the Agile ceremonies and talk about how they will bring you some of these elements that you've actually tried to have for years or even decades in most companies. Now, Enda gave a brief introduction in the beginning, so I'm not going to say a lot about who I am, because that was very nice of you to introduce me. But as he said, I'm Maria, and I've worked the past decade with organizational development and strategic implementation, and for the past 4 or 5 years specifically with Agile transformation as well. So yeah, I'm gonna get started. So I'm gonna take you guys on a little journey together with me over the next 20-25 minutes or so. We're going to talk about how people think and learn, how organizations think and learn, and organizational culture changes. Then we're gonna look at some of the Agile ways of working. And then at the end, I do want to point out some of the larger scale things you need to be careful about when doing large scale transformations as well. So let's start with looking into how people think and how people learn. And there's a bunch of different theories I could have chosen to bring to you here. One of the most, the ones I like the most is Daniel Kahneman. He's written this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. But I'm also going to spend just a couple of minutes explaining it here so that we all know what it's about. So Kahneman is most known for introducing the concept of dual thinking, especially when it comes to decision making, where he has advanced the whole research within how do people actually make decisions, and that we use that using 2 different systems in the brain. So let me just explain those briefly for those of you who haven't been introduced to Kahneman before. So we have system 1 and we have system 2. System 1 is the system that is always on, and it's very, very fast. It's a system that reacts straight away when you meet someone new or something happens around you, to read the world around you. Even before you shake a person's hand, system 1 will have already made a decision about, is this person dangerous or is he nice? Which category am I placing him in? How do I understand this person? Before you've even had a chance to hear the person's name. So system 1 reacts very, very fast. System 1 is always on, which means it's even on when you sleep. So that is, for example, why we dream. That's because system 1 will continue to run in the back of your mind no matter what you do. It is also your long-term memory. It's where we store all the experiences we've had, especially feelings or beliefs about the world that we have is in system 1. And now, as you can imagine, if you need to have a system where your long-term memory is and that needs to be able to react fast, because it's basically your survival mechanism. It's what tells you to move if a car is driving straight towards you. It's what tells you to navigate the world. Is it fight or flight? All of these things are in system 1. You can tell yourself, if you need to be able to react that quickly, you need to have a set of boxes that you understand and translate the world with. That is why system 1 is, unfortunately, you might say, also very, very biased. It has a series of categories or boxes that it understands the world with, and it will always try to put stuff into those boxes that it knows. That's just how it works, to be able to work this fast and without active thinking, you might say, from you. Now, the other system, system 2, is working very slowly, on the other hand, and it requires active concentration from you. This is the system we use to solve most of our tasks in our daily work. If you have to sit and do some programming or work on a Excel analysis or whatever, this is the logical part of the brain that requires focus from you. This is actually quite interesting if you think about that people like you and me pretty much use the system 2 all the time, or have to solve the task we have at work. And we work usually about 8 hours a day. So if you have a think about how long you think you can actually work actively with system 2 at a time, then what would be your estimate here? There's done a lot of research on this. So if I can ask you to write in the chat, how many minutes or hours or whatever days do you believe that you would be able to sit with a task that is logical of nature and work on that? Please write in the Teams chat. We have a few coming in here. Yeah. You guys are actually being very conservative here, because usually in research, when they ask these questions, people usually say 2 to 3 hours at a time is the most common answer. And even some people say they can do it for 8 hours straight, just working straight through the night to get the delivery done or whatever. But research shows that you can actually do so for 50 minutes. After 50 minutes, what they call like the windshield wiper goes down, and you clear your mind and you have to start rebooting system 2 system again. So it's very interesting that you guys are so conservative in your estimates here, and I think that's a healthy show that that you are very aware that creating like these long working meetings where you sit for 5 hours straight and work is maybe not the most optimal way to get stuff done. And that you can actually use this knowledge of system 2 and 1 quite actively, because as I said, system 1 is always on. So sometimes you might have realized sitting with a task using system 2 energy, focus, concentration, and you simply cannot solve it. And then you leave it aside, you go for a run or you take a shower or whatever, and then all of a sudden it hits you and you get the answer right in the middle of your running trip, or in the middle of the night you wake up and then you know. That's because system 1 will continue to work on the problem, even though you have put it aside with your system 2 functions for a moment. So some scientists actually investigate a lot in using this actively, using 40 or 50 minutes to try and solve it, and then timing it. And if you haven't solved it, leave it aside and then come back to it later on. But that's a side notion here. So what is also really important about System 1 and System 2, and interesting in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, is learning. So when you couple Kahneman to our knowledge about learning, it's interesting to see that how you learn the best is by coupling System 1 and System 2. And that to be able to learn something quickly, the best way is to go through both systems at the same time. And then over time, the competency will be stored in System 1. One example of this is if you are an experienced driver now, you have most likely experienced driving somewhere that you're familiar with, like to work, and then realizing you don't really know how you got there. Going, oh, did I just drive here? Was that actually dangerous? Because I didn't even notice that I was driving. That's because System 1 has taken over your driving skills because you've been doing it for so many years. But if you think back to when you had to learn how to drive, you likely remember having to focus all of your System 2 energy at the same time as sitting there in the car. You had to remember to shift the gears, to look in the mirrors, to check your shoulder, all of these elements. Your System 2 was highly engaged, and over time, it got stored more and more in System 1. And research shows that if you want to learn something new, combining System 1 and 2 is the most effective way, especially if you can find a way to connect to the feelings in System 1. And that is because long-term memory is very much dependent on feelings. If you think about the memories you have from your childhood or early adulthood, I will bet you that all of the strong memories you have is connected to a feeling. It can be a sad feeling, it can be a happy feeling, but they're connected to some kind of feeling. It can even be some of the more unfortunate ones, like feeling of shame, which is a really powerful feeling. Those kind of memories really stick in the long-term memory. So if you can somehow find a way to combine whatever learning or change of culture you would like to feelings, that's the most strong tool you can use for learning. So I'm gonna take you on a little metaphorical walk here, because there's another theory I really like when talking about learning and creating habits in the brain, and that's Annette Prehn. And she's a Danish sociologist who have written great books, both about leadership and also about child behavior and other psychology topics. But she has this great metaphor that I really like to understand all of this and how we create learning and changes, which is a walk in the forest. So she says, creating a new learning or any kind of learning is actually creating paths in a forest, just like you're creating neurons are wired together in the brain. So imagine paths in the forest that you have walked on many times. Those are clearly like highways through a forest. Whereas if you have to create a new path in the forest, walking in the forest wilderness for the first time is really, really difficult. If you walk there once, there will not be a path. If you walk there 10 times, there will still not be a path. You have to walk there hundreds of times before you actually have a path through the forest. And likewise, if you have an old habit or an old learning that was a highway, it's really, really difficult to remove it. Even if you stop walking on it and stop using it. Let's take an example of extensive reporting in an organization. If you're used to that in an organization, then it's very, very difficult to stop doing it because people know that path, they know that road, they're used to walking that road. So I really like this metaphor and keeping it in mind when we look at it and see how walking in the forest repeatedly and many times, so combining System 1 and 2 repeatedly and many times is how you create new paths in the forest, create new habits, and create new learning. So that is how, or that is at least some theory about how people think and how people learn. Let's then look at how organizations think and learn, and keeping in mind what we just learned about Kahneman and Prehn. Here, I want to bring another theorist to the table, who's Edgar Schein, who's a psychologist who's written a lot about organizational culture. And he has this great iceberg metaphor that I really like to understand organizational culture with and work with, which is like an iceberg. Some parts of the culture is visible to you. Those are at the very top. Those are the ones that you can actually walk in to a company and see. You can see how people are dressed. You can see how people talk to each other. You can see how they, what's on the walls. How are they sitting? How are they interacting with each other? The stuff you can see above the water, but that is also just the tiniest part of an organizational culture, just like the iceberg. Now, right underneath the water surface is a few elements that you might be able to see if you look for them through the water surface. You can see the company strategy on the website, maybe. You can see the values of the company might be posted on some posters or on the website, etc. And then at the very bottom of the iceberg is the elements that you cannot see. It's the very darkest part of the water, but it's also the biggest part of the iceberg and the biggest part of the culture. This is where the organizational beliefs lies, the biases lies about them and us culture. We see this in very many companies about, IT having theories about how business works, business having theories about how IT works. Operations is a whole different topic. These kind of beliefs and biases that we see all the time, which is buried so far beneath, you'll not be able to read about it at any site or any place. You might not even be able to see it if you walk in and see them. It's something stored way down below. Now, looking at this theory, one might look at the bottom here and think, oh, that's actually very much what we saw from System 1 thinking with Kahneman. And that is completely right. And also very interesting when we know System 1 decision-making happens really, really fast, which means for a company culture as well, when they decide on something, it is likely to be based on the biases and the beliefs of the culture rather than System 2 parts, strategy, and so on of the culture, which is why we need to work with this bottom part as well when we do transformation. And if you're sitting there thinking, this person is crazy for trying to combine Schein and Kahneman, let me just quickly mention that I'm not the first one to do so. There's been many scientists who've done the same. A really interesting one to read up on is Luhmann. He actually has done massive research about social systems, both from an individual to a team, to departments, to companies, to countries, to the world as a culture. And he's actually shown us that how an individual creates a narrative about themselves and their own competencies is very similar to how a team learns and creates narratives and how an organization does that. So the functions, how we create beliefs, feelings, and biases and so on is very similar. And he also combines these theories. And he has a really strong point about that it's through narratives that is the most powerful tool to work with the feelings and create this storytelling. So let's keep that in mind for a few more minutes and try to combine these different theories. I've now brought up a bunch of them, so let's see how they work together, right? So you see Schein's iceberg here, and then the point is, if it is similar to individual learning and thinking, which Luhmann and others seem to believe it is, and me as well, it's about combining all the elements that we have, all the way down to the bottom feelings, when you do any kind of changes. And as we know from Prehn and walking in the forest, it's about making this journey repeatedly for a bunch of times. And now what I have seen a lot in previous implementations is unfortunately that people have a tendency to start at the middle with some kind of burning platform. We create a strategy, maybe we launch new values, and then we work our way upwards. So we create maybe new titles for people or whatever can be seen at the top of the iceberg. Maybe we shift around how people sit. Now they're not called teams, now they're called squads, whatever. But we forget to work with the bottom part of the iceberg here when we do the transformations. Now let me talk a little bit about how Agile affects this. So Agile affects culture in an organization by doing this combination through the iceberg and by doing it repeatedly. So the strong part about Agile is this repetitive cycle that you use so that you do these ceremonies, artifacts, and events again and again and again, so that you make this connection between what you can see, the strategy you want to implement, and then the bottom part of the iceberg. And I'm just going to grab a few of the artifacts and the events here so that you can see what I mean with some concrete examples. And I just want to briefly mention that I'm not a fan of any one tool or framework in particular. I don't really care if it's Safe or Less or Nexus or Scrum or whatever. So don't lay too much into if I call it a daily Scrum or if I call it a daily stand-up or what I call it. That's not the point. The point is that these kind of repeated ceremonies or events can give you something to the culture. So let me just bring up a few of them. First, some of the artifacts, like the prioritized backlog or the release plan you might have for an increment or a quarter or however long you choose. By having a backlog which is clearly prioritized and which is presented in a why we need to do something mode, that actually helps a lot with your culture if you work with it in the right way. It creates transparency, both within the team and outside the team, especially if you also have a release plan that you coordinate with other teams. It creates collaboration to other teams because they can see what is prioritized and why. And it creates empowerment if you actually get the opportunity to write them in a why statement and let the team decide how to solve it. It seems like something very easy, but it's really not that easy when you try to do epics and have to write them in a why sort of fashion. But by doing this again and again and again, you will see more empowerment, collaboration, and transparency over time. Another point is the sprint planning and the daily scrums or daily stand-ups for that matter, which is this forum where you, by doing this sort of conversational term taking, everybody gets to say something. You see that people feel like they're being heard, especially, I don't know if you are Scrum Masters or Agile coaches or what you guys are, but this is one of the places where that role becomes really important because that is the person that creates the environment of trust, or one of the people. All the team is responsible, of course, but this is where you can get transparency, who's doing what, both today and in this sprint. How do we collaborate together? Who is empowered to take which decisions? Those kind of elements. And I've seen this actually becoming a really, really strong tool for teams, especially in this virtual world that we're in right now. Having that daily morning call can really bring some culture into the team of transparency that you then get a lot easier, and over time you get that collaboration and trust that you need. Another one, and one of the more difficult ones, is the review or demo session. And why I say it's difficult, it's not that much for the team. Of course, it requires the team to be bold and do something new, but it's actually, when I talk about the leaders, this is where the role of leaders, whether you call them tribe leads or product owners or whatever, not that important, this is where the leader has to work in the right way. He or she have to come in, give feedback at the right level. Don't get involved at how the problem is solved, but if the problem is actually solved, so the why of it, give empowerment to the team and create transparency. And if there needs to be transparency, you need to make sure that you're not doing watermelon demo sessions, meaning you cannot color everything green if it's red on the inside. The demo sessions has to be bold and honest. And that hurts. And in my experience, you cannot get it right on the first try or the second try. You need to try this a bunch of times before you hit the right level of who needs to be there for the demo session, which stakeholders or customers or whatever do I use there, how many people, how do I run it, how done does a product need to be before I show it there, and so on. Which brings me to the next topic, which is about minimum viable products, which is actually a concept from the lean world, but Agile has adopted it as well. And my point here is that, and that's also really difficult, especially if you're in an environment or an organization where you are used to being the one with the answers. It's really difficult to become the one asking and showing half-finished stuff to customers or users. but by prototyping minimum viable products, showing them often instead of waiting to the very end to show something, is where you become truly customer centric, which is, I'm sure, something all of you have had on your strategy slides for at least a decade by now. But my experience is if you actually do it in this way, you slowly start to actually put the customer needs in the center. Now, the last one, and in my opinion, based on the comments or the learnings we know from Luhmann about narratives, retrospectives is one of the most important things. And it's also, unfortunately, in my experience, one of the ceremonies that get cut first if there's a pressure on time, which is a shame, because the retrospective is where you create your culture. It is where you create the narrative. It is where you re-walk the path and you agree which path did we actually walk on these past 2 weeks, and which path would we actually like to walk on for the next 2 weeks, and how can we make it an even better path together. And that is why if you skip the retrospectives, you won't get that narrative created together as a team or as a department, and you won't get the cultural changes you're wishing to see. So that was a few of the ceremonies and artifacts, and my point is that by doing a lot of these and doing them repeatedly, so you do it again and again and again, you would create that path in the forest, both in the individuals and as teams and departments and so on, and as organizations. You can be a Trojan horse to create the impact you want to see. And now some of you might sit there and think, this woman is like taking out of the cargo cult, if you've heard about those kind of things, but it's not. So the final point I want to make for the last couple of minutes here, before we can go into some questions, is you also have to think about a few large-scale transformation tips and tricks when doing these kind of things. It's of course not enough to just roll out agile ceremonies and then you're there. So doing large-scale transformations, again, there's a bunch of different theories I could have brought up here, but I've chosen this one, Leading Transformation, which is a really nice read if you haven't read it. And it's about that we know there's a lot of biases in an organization and in individuals, and we cannot remove all the biases, but we can minimize them by using 3 tips or 3 actions. First, we need a strategic narrative. Second, we need to break bottlenecks. And thirdly, we need clear targets or KPIs. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on each, and then I'm done, and we can have some time for questions if you have any. So when I go through each of these 3, please remember what we just learned about system 1 and 2 and paths in the brain, how culture changes and so on. And then let me just explain. So the first point of the book is you need to have a strategic narrative. We've known already from Luhmann how important it is, but the point is also that by having a strong strategic narrative, and the authors here actually mean storytelling. So they mean in the most wild way, hire a story writer person who can actually create a story that engages people. It needs to have a hero, it needs to have challenges, it needs to have a point of no return, and it needs to have a goal at the end, so that you have people focusing on the story, and it needs to activate feelings within people. And usually most people, like at least like me, if I have to sit down and write a story, I would not be able to do one that actually activates people's feelings. I would need someone with more experience in story writing to help me with that. So they have examples of companies hiring like science fiction writers to do this kind of storytelling about what is it we want to do, how do we get there. And the point is that it's actually you telling the story of which way through the forest are we going to walk together before even walking it, so that people see the path through the forest before even getting started on it. And that helps a lot with the clarity of people, and it actually starts combining the nerves in the brain even before you've begun. Second point of the book is that any change is difficult and you will meet barriers along the way. And when doing new paths in the forest, it's really fragile. Imagine you're walking on a new path, you convinced a bunch of people to walk with you on the path, and then all of a sudden you hit a roadblock. I can promise you all the people will say, well, this old path that I know, which is a highway, is a lot better. I'm just going to turn around and go that path because I know that path. And that's a lot easier. So I'm just going to go back because that's difficult. There's a blocker in the road. I'm not going to do that. So you need to find a way to either remove the barriers or work them into your narrative. So one example of that is I've seen a bunch of companies trying to, when engaging in the Agile world, they seem to think that being Agile means being free. You don't have to do risk assessments. I don't have to be as careful with security, whatever. I can just work freely. And that is a great point if you are a small scale startup or something where you don't have a huge risk to look at. But most companies doesn't work like that. Most companies, you simply have to have your compliance and your risk in order. So if you meet a barrier like that you cannot break, you need to go back into your narrative and change the narrative so that it's part of the narrative that, of course, I have my compliance and my risk in place while working Agile, for example. And that it's part of your Agile ceremonies or sprint cycles to take that into account. And then some bottlenecks you will be able to remove, like extensive reporting or other bottlenecks that you might have, funding issues that are in a way that doesn't fit the Agile world has been some of the bottlenecks I've seen in the past, and those you can actually change, but it takes a lot of hard work to do so. Lastly, and I really hate KPIs as a term, to be honest, but the point in the book is really important, which is by now you have convinced people to join you, to walk in the wilderness of a forest. And if you're not able to show them that you're going in the right direction, it's only a matter of time before they will look at you and say, this guide is completely off, that doesn't work. So you need to find a way to place signposts along the way, and you won't meet any signposts because it's a new path you're walking on. So you have to create them yourself. And one point in the book that I really like is you can change them while you walk. You don't have to create some measurement points now that also have to stand true in 5 years from now. You can change them as often as you would like. If they don't make sense anymore, throw them away. And then just keep showing some progress pointers so that people keep following you on this change initiative that you have. I've had good experience seeing companies doing behavioral indicators. So instead of key performance indicators, they've looked more at some kind of behavioral indicators. So do we see, for example, retrospective being canceled, or do people actually host it? Do we see people in general in their pulse survey or whatever you have being more happy? Do we see customer satisfaction as well, which is not necessarily any indicator of like money-wise performance, but it's a key indicator in people behavior. Those kind of stuff, if you can measure that and show that, it's awesome. Otherwise, find more alternative ways to measure. If it's for only a while that you need to measure on something, maybe not as inspiring, but will still show you in the same direction. An example could be, how many Scrum Masters do we have hired? How many people are actually using Jira, something like that. It's not the best measurements in the world, for sure. We can all agree on that, but change them as you go and just keep showing people that you are moving in the right direction so they don't feel lost in the wilderness and feel like you haven't done any progress at all. That's the last point. My point is that Agile practices, Agile ways of working, it holds within it the capacity to really change your company culture and the way you learn as a company. And if you remember these sort of surrounding elements, you can build a really strong transformation in your company as well. So I'm gonna thank you all for now, and then I'm going to shift screens so we can go into Slido and you can ask questions, and you can also vote on each other's questions in there. So it's just going to take me a few seconds to do so. And I see some people has also written in the chat. And yes, Linda Rising is a great read as well. Recommend her too. And she also has a bunch of YouTube videos. Really easy to watch and learn from as well, if you like the more easy way to learning. Yeah, so let me see if I can switch this. Okay. So I see one question has come in already, and some questions are coming. And let me just present so you can see what's coming in, and you can also go in there and vote if there are specific questions you would like answered. Okay. You can see the questions in the teams now, right? Yes, people are
Yes.
Perfect. What is the psychology between watermelon demo sessions? Yeah, that's a good question. I guess there's a lot of psychologists you could choose to look at. I don't actually know which is the best one. I'll have to go back and do some more research on that one. But the term is something we've seen in a bunch of companies, especially the companies that has a history of not being too keen on failures or mistakes. So if you have a company culture where you're not allowed to have mistakes and failures, and it's hit quite hard if you do have them, you see this watermelon principle going to happen both at demo sessions, but also in reporting in general. And you will see them becoming more and more green as they move up the hierarchy. Typical, you would see someone at the ground doing a report saying we are in red, and then the next level would say, nah, it's not red, right? It's like orange or something. And then the next person would go, nah, it's a little like lime green, right? And then once it hits the top of the organization, it's somehow turned green. But it's the fear of failure, as far as my experience goes, that really creates that kind of environment. But that's an interesting question about the psychologist part. I'll have to look up. I'm sure a lot of psychologists has written about this topic as well. So I'm gonna just do this. Okay. What do you recommend? Top down or bottom up change or something else? This is also a great question, and it's a dilemma we see over and over again in a bunch of companies. So of course, it's easier if you have the top management on board, like any other change. It's a lot easier if someone at the top tells you, this is the path we're going on, get with it or get out. That's, of course, easier. I've seen a bunch of companies, and I've also been there myself trying to do it bottom up. It's a fight, right? You have a feeling of having your sword and your shield in the hands every morning, getting to work, trying to do this bottom up. It can be a struggle, but there's a few tips and tricks if you do it bottom up you can use. For example, creating one bubble, one area, one moonshot, call it what you would like, that is actually willing to go on this journey with you and take them on the path in the forest. If you do that, my experience is that you have to create a bubble around them. So make sure that no one interrupts them, no one comes and asks them to take the old highway. Even when the pressure hits them, they cannot go on that old highway. They need to bury that and go on the new path every time. So that, in my experience, you would need some kind of adapter, 1, 2, 3 people whose only job is to protect the bubble. If you do that and you're able to show that they can then work faster, and then you can do that 1, 2, 3 times, my experience is then the top down will follow and they will see that this is a good idea. I would recommend for sure top down if possible, but that's not always within our control, right? So sometimes you have to do the bottom up instead. Do you have any suggestions how risk compliance could be incorporated? Yes, I've actually seen some pretty innovative ways of trying to say within your Agile ceremonies, you have specific events also concerning risks. I've seen some companies having a specific risk owner in the squads, being responsible to make sure that is always taken care of. I don't know if I would recommend that, but at least it's a starting point. I've seen people add an event called risk management that they do every sprint to make sure it's taken care of. Then I've seen the more advanced part where they actually build in the controls they need into the CI/CD pipelines if it's IT development. I've seen examples of that as well, which is what I would recommend, but which is also by far the most extensive way of dealing with this, right? I hope that answered the question. In your experience, why are retrospectives the first ones to be eliminated? That's a good question, actually. I haven't thought about why that's always the case. I've just seen it so many times that once the team gets busy, it sort of feels like that can wait. It's not urgent, right? So it's the prioritization between what is urgent and what is important, which is always difficult in any kind of tasks to be able to say sometimes what is important, you need to take that more than what is urgent. But in a team, you always have something that is urgent, right? No matter what. So it usually gets prioritized down. And my advice is just don't do that. And make sure if you're the ones responsible for retrospectives, make sure it's really well prepared. Make sure it's facilitated with great energy, with the right tools and music and whatever you need, especially in this virtual world, to make it a great learning experience for everybody, because then they will keep prioritizing it. Whereas I've seen sometimes a tribe coach or agile coach coming in, doing it sort of like left-handed, like, okay, what could be better, guys? And then, of course, that's going to be the event that's going to be canceled next time people are busy. So my advice is to really do something extraordinary with the retrospective so that it becomes your learning environment. And then you will see great learning happening, I'm sure. At least that's my experience. When it comes to never-ending deadlines, it can be very hard to argue against going back to the old path. Never-ending deadlines. So I've worked in teams that didn't actually develop products also, where working in sprints became difficult. And there I've seen adopting to something more Kanban style can be a good approach, because then you don't have sort of the hard deadline of a sprint. Then what would you then demo becomes a challenge. So there's pros and cons with both. My advice is that you can still benefit a lot from many of the ceremonies because of all the elements we've just talked about. So for example, doing a daily stand-up where you discuss what is focused for today, you create transparency, you create collaboration, you agree, okay, so Peter needs to talk to Simon today because you have something to work on together that needs a combination, whatever. You decide on that every morning, you create the flow in the project. It's actually the most important thing rather than working agile. As I said, many frameworks could be used here. You can also look at have double or whatever tools you may want to use. The important part is creating flow in the team. And that never-ending deadlines part, a key element there I've been a product owner for one of those teams that had these kind of deadlines, is cutting the epics so that they can actually end is the difficult part. So that you take the never-ending deadlines, you cut the work into pieces that can be finished so that the team feels some kind of progress and overview is the difficult but also very giving element of that. Then, are you using Scrum as an example? Do you think the behavioral and cognitive aspects were included intentionally in Scrum? I've actually thought about this for quite a while, because I've read a lot about, the four forefathers of Agile sitting in a cabin, creating the values and the principles and whatever. And I don't think that they have been looking at Kahneman thinking, I suggest we have a retrospective or something like that. I think they have based it, this is just my opinion, so I don't know, but I think they've based it on years of experience creating flow in teams. And then because it's years of experience, it fits nicely with all of this theory. But I don't know, maybe there were experts in the psychology theory as well. And then there's a final one in here saying behavioral indicators. Could you provide some more examples? Let me think. It's a key topic, right? If you Google Agile KPIs, you'll get so many different views and so many different versions of it. I've seen really bad ones happening. I've also unfortunately seen ones that has actually went against what we were trying to do. So one example of that is a bi-weekly sprint report having to be created so that we could see if the team did all the sprint elements. So then the teams had to sit there every 2 weeks, do a report, send that into head office to make sure that they were doing Agile, right? Which is an awful, awful example. Don't do that, because that just is completely the opposite of all the empowerment and the Agile values that we're trying to implement. I've also seen them trying to do some more observation type KPIs. So they walked around, that's of course difficult in these virtual times, but they walked around the building doing Gemba walks, looking at how do they actually do their daily stand-ups, how do they do sprint planning, can we coach them, can we help them? And then they did some more qualitative observation points about how far are we, how mature are we, and how much could we improve by doing some more in these and that areas. Those are one of the best, but also the most time-consuming ones. Then I've seen a bunch of companies do surveys to actually ask people, ask the employees, do you feel more empowered than you did 6 months ago? Do you feel happy in your workplace? Are you even aware that we are in the middle of an Agile transformation? For example, those kind of questions. In one case, I've seen it built around the ADKAR model, which is a strong tool to try and build a strong change management tool that you can build your service around to see, are we in an awareness phase, desire phase, knowledge, ability, or reinforcement phase? How far is each area and on their maturity towards working Agile? And then you can build your own sort of maturity model. I've seen that a bunch of times as well, trying to measure that, but that's also quite extensive because you need to send surveys and those kind of things too. So yeah, I've seen different elements. Yeah. Questions are done in Slido, or at least there's no more right now. We do have like 5 minutes, I believe. If anyone has any questions, I am more than open to answer more. Otherwise, you're also welcome to reach out. If next week or something you think, I forgot to ask about this one thing, feel free to connect on LinkedIn or send me an email. And I think the recording will also be shared on the event page, so you can see it there.
Indeed. So thank you very much, Maria, for this very exciting talk and all the efforts for interaction. Also for taking the time to cover all the questions. Thank you all the participants for being with us and prioritizing this session. We hope that you had good takeaways and inspiration. As Maria also mentioned, we will share the recording and the slides, I guess, in the event page. And we are always eager to get your feedback regarding this session and suggestions for future sessions. You can use the event page and MeetUp communication for that. So we would like to wish you a great afternoon and looking forward to seeing you in our future sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.